Swamp Thing was created in 1972 by Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson. Now there's a new incarnation of the Swamp Thing by artists Stephen Bissette and John Totleben and writer Alan Moore. It's one of DC's fastest-growing fan favorites. We asked Len what he thinks of the new Swamp Thing.
Biggest question people ask me is, how could you let him do that to your characters? You know, don't you hate what he's doing? And people who don't realize that I picked him to do that. I have no problems with it. It's his book now. He's taken it in different places. I really enjoy what he's doing with the book. And as Karen Berger probably attests, as soon as a new script comes in, I demand a copy as soon as she's done reading it, just so I can see what he's doing. I'm fascinated by it.
One of the reasons the book works so well is the shared vision of the Swamp Thing's artistic team. Editor Karen Berger coordinates their efforts.
Before Alan even came to the book, Steve and John had their own visions of the character, and coincidentally it happened to be Alan's, close to Alan's as well in terms of getting into really revamping the character and really getting to the horror aspect of the book.
We asked Alan Moore to give us his ideas about horror.
We're going to try and actually focus upon the reality of American horror and see if we've got some good material there to turn horror comics out of. That's the plans.
You seem to be focusing on world horror too, aren't you? Going to deal with nuclear war?
Well, I tend to think that the horror that existed in the 40s with the Universal films, it's played out. It's a different audience now. I mean, what frightens people these days is not the idea of a werewolf jumping out at them. It's the idea of a nuclear war or any of the sort of the things that we are coursing through our society at the moment, and I think that to really frighten people, you have to somehow ground the horror in their own experience, things that they're frightened of. I mean, in a recent Swamp Thing, I managed to touch upon bug fear, because everybody's frightened of bugs, it doesn't matter how big and tough they are, you get a big enough spider, and so everybody backs away from it. So, I suppose it's a bit cynical and manipulating, but I do like to try and put my finger upon the exact nerve, if possible, of what really scares people. It's sadism, and I'm getting paid for it,
But you also have a conviction about writing that what you're scared of, you won't write something that you're not scared of? Or?
Certainly. I mean, I think there was one of those ancient Chinese sages who say so many deep and interesting things, and they said that in order for your audience to enjoy your work, you've got to enjoy it. You've got to feel really strongly about what you're doing in order to have the conviction to actually communicate it to another person. If you write a funny story and you don't laugh, then why should anybody else? And if you write a story that doesn't frighten you, then you're not going to frighten anybody else. I mean, I actually reduced myself to sort of slobbering terror in the course of writing some of these stories. You have to really press the buttons that make you feel disturbed, which probably puts my family under great stress because, I'm sort of sitting there under my writing table, gibbering with my hands over my eyes, but I do feel that strongly. It has to affect you, or it's not going to affect anybody else.
How do you write? What is your mood?
Well, I have done a little bit of acting in a very minor way, so I try to approach writing from a method acting point of view, the Marlon Brando touch. So in order to write Swamp Thing, you have to lay in a bath with a load of mud and lugworms for a couple of weeks, and then you're in about the right mood to actually sit down and write a Swamp Thing script,
Okay, now answer me seriously.
Sure. Well, I don't know, it's pretty serious. I mean, I do get into a character to the point where I sit in front of a mirror and try and imagine what it would feel like to be that character, how their body would feel, whether it would be heavier than mine or lighter than mine, how they'd move. And it's pretty psychotic. I'm glad I work alone, because if anyone could see me while I was working, then I would probably be in one of the jackets that does up at the back by now, But I sit there in front and I put on a voice, I talk to myself. I probably shouldn't be revealing this in front of an audience, but I do. I actually get into the part where I'm acting out my dialogue and seeing how it sounds. And trying to imagine a real person saying it, and that does help to get the flow and to get the characters accurate. And I think people can tell in the final analysis, But again, it's something where if I've got a particularly horrible character to portray, then it doesn't do very much for the people around me. But for the days when I'm writing that character, I'll become a pretty unpleasant person for that stretch of time,
How does your family deal with that? Who are your family? Tell us about
My wife Phyllis and my two adorable daughters Leah and Amber, 3 and 6, and they've got used to it by now. You know, that they see sort of Daddy coming downstairs with a strange expression on his face, and yeah, I mean, they know, they don't get alarmed by it anymore.
This is the piece of art that got Stephen John the job on the Swamp Thing. Alan met his collaborators recently for the first time.
Steve and John are terrific. I mean, I could that they're a pair of absolute maniacs, and there is no one better to work on Swamp Thing. I mean, it was quite extraordinary. When I was asked to take over the book, one of the things that I was asked was, you know, like, what do you want to do with the character? And I started thinking about it and trying to come up with a way in which we could make him more of a Swamp Thing, that we could show all the little patches of fungus and pin mold and lichen that are growing on him, you know, and actually get an impression that this is a vegetable, that he's crawling with insects, that he's a mass of sodden plant fibre. He's not just a guy in a green suit. And when I wrote this to Steve and John, I mean, they were saying, yeah, this is just what we want to do. You know, it was just pure coincidence, but in 2 separate countries we seem to have arrived at a similar idea as to how we wish to treat the character. And of course Steve and John have been putting in no end of ideas, which I've been picking up on. We're just very much in tune on the book. I mean, I don't know if I could do it without them, because they are just so incredible. They get everything absolutely right. What I'm trying to do is to get into a character who's almost an elemental force. Swamp Thing's intelligence is not human. He experiences what's going on in the soil and the plant life around him. He knows where the insects are laying their eggs. He knows, you know, where the fish are spawning and sort of stuff like that. He's got the whole swamp inside his mind. He's connected to it. And that perspective, it's an alien intelligence. He sees things differently to human beings. His values are different. And he's like an earth spirit. He's a very primal character, a very pagan character. And that's the way I've been trying to sort of interpret him, that his thought processes are very slow and geologic, but that yeah, he has got this sort of empathy with the earth and the plant life and the bugs and the birds, and it just gives a different perspective. It's very interesting, well, to me anyway, it's a very interesting perspective to write about, to sort of try and get the reader involved in an utterly alien experience, to sort of drag them into something that they've not experienced before, to get them to see through the eyes of this vegetable, you know, to see what the world's like from the point of view of its plant life.
The anatomy lesson was the first turning point in the life of the Swamp Thing. The controversial Love and Death was another, because it was published without the Comic Code approval.
I feel very smug about that. I sort of hug myself in the middle of the night when I think about that, because I like the idea of having Swamp Thing free of the code. Not so that we can do any grotesque physical violence or sex, but so that we can do stories that an adult could read and find something interesting in them. You know, and the fact that we wrote this story, I believe the actual issue 29 was the one that caused the problems. But in that, yeah, I mean, Karen really backed us on that. Karen Berger, the book's editor, she really went and fought for it, and her and Dick Giordano made this very brave decision to go without the code, for which I'm eternally grateful for them. You know, that was terrific. I mean, with issue 29, I think that one of the things that happened there was it was a difference in cultures. You know, like I didn't realise that incest and necrophilia were still frowned on socially over here. You know, because of course in England they're part of the whole social fibre. You know, if I'd known that, I wouldn't have done the story, but it happened, and there you go. You know. If you ask somebody outside the comics arena what they think of comics, the first thing they think of is Adam West with his paunch and sort of running up the side of the building and the bam sock pow and all that sort of stuff, which is not a very sort of endearing image. You know, I think we'd like to be taken a little bit more seriously than that, and I don't think that a lot of the films that are coming out about comic book characters are helping any. I'd like to see someone do a really serious film that was as well written as the comics are sometimes. You know, I mean, I think that would be nice, but I've not got any real hope of it happening in the immediate future. I've got no great desire to do anything other than comics. I think that it's a bit of a shame that sometimes people tend to regard, even people in the industry, tend to regard comics as the poor relation. It's something to be doing until they get a job on television or writing proper novels or doing films. I mean, for me, that tends to degrade comics a little bit. I think that if comics aren't the art form that they should be, it's the fault of me and the other people in the field. We should be doing something about it. And I think that comics are a wonderful art form, and I think that nobody really, since the great era of American newspaper strips, nobody really has come anywhere close to sort of realising the possibilities of comics. I think there's an awful lot of work to do. It's very much like if the first films had been short children's cartoon films, and as a result of that, people had said, well, this is obviously a medium for kids, then you'd never have had a Citizen Kane, you'd never have had a Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. All these films just would not have happened because they're adult films, and they wouldn't have occurred in a children's medium. And that's what's happened in comics. People say comics are for kids, so therefore, it's got to the stage where unless you want to put a comic out which probably hasn't got a market for it, you do something for kids. Now that's starting to change now, and I could see, with a bit of luck, in 10 years maybe we'll have a medium that will be as important as films or as literature.
In England, though, comics are taken more seriously than in this country?
Perhaps slightly, but I think that in general, in the rest of Europe, in France, in Italy, in Spain, comics are taken very seriously. You'll find a review of a comic book alongside a review of a new ballet or a new film. You can open the papers and nobody thinks that you're retarded for reading comics. It's something that an adult can do without risking social disgrace. Whereas I think in this country and in my own country, I think that the people who read comics, well, it's a bit like people who collect barbed wire. It's very interesting, but you wouldn't want one moving in next door to you. And I think there is that stigma attached. You're regarded as abnormal if you don't stop reading comics at the age of 12. And that's true in my country as well as yours. It's changing. I mean, hopefully I'll be able to do this job in 10 years and sort of walk down the street and hold my head up proud, But at the moment, it's still regarded as a very cheap pulp gutter medium.
How do you see that changing? Or how do you see the implementation of that?
Well, I think that, for one thing, we have to break out of the current ghetto that comics are in that comics have been wooing a fairly small audience of fans, because those fans are regular readers, they'll buy the book month after month, they can be depended upon. Now that's good in terms of short-term sales, but in the long term, it means that your audience is shrinking and just getting smaller and smaller as you appeal to a more select and specialised minority. What we need to do is to get people who've not read comics before. I did hear from Steve Bissett that on one of the panels that he'd been sort of talking to some of the fans, that there were a lot of Swamp Thing fans who were coming to the book not from comics, but from Stephen King and Peter Straub. And if we can get that sort of readership, if we can grab a part of that adult readership that reads proper, respectable books, then I think we'll be home and dry. I mean, another thing that I would like to see is more women reading comics, because there's a whole vast audience out there who just won't touch a comic book, and I can understand why they won't touch it, because there's really nothing in comics to attract a woman, because it's mainly boys' power fantasies, which is, as a boy, I mean, I enjoy them as much as anybody else, but I can see that for women there's something lacking, and I think DC are starting to move in that direction. They're planning to sort of do things that perhaps will drag in the women readers, and I think that will be a big step forward.
The success of the Swamp Thing is kind of amazing, because the horror genre is not one that usually, or am I wrong in that?
Oh, you're right. I think that the horror genre, while it was popular about 10 years ago, in comics at least, I think that Swamp Thing is the only surviving book in the horror field. Now I find that strange, because as horror comics have lost their popularity, then horror itself seems to have permeated every other art form to excess. The film industry is a whole string of murdered teenagers. I mean, just all these sort of chop 'em up films. I mean, that's not the sort of horror that I like to do, but it is horror, and it seems that people are really crying out for that stuff. I don't know why, you know, when things are so miserable anyway, why they should sort of want something that makes them feel even more depressed, but then that's people for you. You know, I think that, for my part, what you have to do is do horror that actually scares people. Because in comics, I think that a lot, you have people going through the motions. You'll get a funny comic book that is not actually funny. You'll recognise that it's a funny comic book because it's got characters with big noses and big feet, but you could never in a million years laugh at it. And you'll get horror comic books which, although they've got werewolves and vampires and things that go bump in the night in them, then they don't really raise your hackles very much. You know, I think that with Swamp Thing we have tried to do a book which will actually scare its readership, you know, and yeah, it seems that it's working, you know, from what I hear.
To find out what Alan's planning on scaring the readership with in the future, we went to editor Karen Berger.
It's this odyssey that Swamp Thing goes on. It's called the American Gothic, and basically Swamp Thing is going through the dark underside of America in order to save the earth from being destroyed by these spiritual people who live on a different plane of existence. And since Swamp Thing is in touch with spiritual things now, he's the likely candidate to do this. And we're going to be introducing a lot of horror aspects in this as well. We're going to have a couple of vampire stories, a couple of werewolf stories, haunted house stories, and but it's up to Swamp Thing. I mean, he travels all through America, but he also can come back to the swamp because of his teleportation, organic teleportation abilities now. So he does come back and visit Abby, who's going to be going on trial, actually, for living with a swamp creature. And she's, you know, poor Abby.
What are the projects you have planned for DC?
Well, there's a book that I've just been talking to Dick Giordano about, and it's called Watchmen. And what we want to do is to actually examine the implications of the superhero if these observed characters were real, just what they'd do to the world. In that, if there had been a Superman ever, the world would be unrecognisable. Because, well, if you've got a character of Superman's level and power working for the Americans, then what would American foreign policy be like? I should imagine it would perhaps be a little bit more adventurous than it is at present, and I should imagine that Russian foreign policy would be a little less adventurous than it is at present, and you'd have a very different world situation. So we want to play around with that angle of it. We want to try and examine some of the things that really would happen if there were superheroes. And that's not something that you can do in the actual DC universe without closing down half the books. You know, so we're just going to do a little story that's totally separate from the rest of the DC continuity, just about all these strange, obsessed super characters in a very, very bleak, grim world. And we examine the political aspect and we examine the social aspect, and yeah, we've got a few interesting things coming up, and I'm really looking forward to getting into that one.
How did Alan come to do Swamp Thing?
Sort of by accident. He had never done any work for the American comics. He was very prominent in the British comic magazines. They publish those things weekly over there as opposed to the way we publish them here. There are things like 2000 AD in particular is a science fiction superhero weekly comic magazine. And I have friends in England. I was over there visiting, and they sometimes send me magazines. And I found his work in those magazines and fell in love with it. I said, boy, he's the guy for the book when I needed a replacement for the previous writer.
Len rang me up just one night. I thought it was one of my friends playing a practical joke and putting on a funny American accent, you know, and but no, it was the real Len Wein, and he said, would you like to write Swamp Thing? And, you know, when I'd picked myself off the floor, I said, yes, yeah, I could just about manage that. And
yeah, I called from the office one day at about 4 or 5 in the afternoon, which meant it was probably 10 or 11 at night, you know. And I get this phone call from some strange American going, hello, Alan. Yes, this is Len Wein calling from DC Comics. And it was this long pause. Really? Yes. And we started talking, and I explained what I was interested in, and it turned out he was a big Swamp Thing fan.
Len was the guy who created the character, and Len was my editor, which made me feel a little bit nervous in that I was suggesting all these sweeping changes in the character to the guy who'd invented it. But Len was very supportive, and he just said, yeah, go ahead, this sounds good. Which I wasn't expecting, but I was very gratified to get that sort of treatment. You know, it was lovely.
Did you
to read the interview that I did with Len, you'll have to read it. I asked him about the Swamp Thing, and he said, well, I must say that although I enjoy it, was probably one of my favorite books to write, I'm glad Alan Moore's doing it now because his work on it dwarfs my own.
That's nice. I mean, a bit embarrassing. I mean, I've got the greatest respect for Len's writing, and sort of, I wish he wouldn't say these things. I mean, it's very nice, but that gives me quite a lot to live up to. You know, I think I'd rather play it quiet and sort of, you know, take it at its own speed. But yeah, I mean, that's great that Len and the people at DC have been giving me such a lot of support, because I've been doing some outrageous things that I didn't really expect to get away with, you know, and I found that DC had been more than prepared to indulge my most insane whims.